The title of this thing, as you just pointed out, has one problem, but it has two problems. Has science buried God? Suggests that there's one God. Like the God that the people who organize this thing and William believe in is somehow special. But that's not true. There are lots of gods. And science has buried all of them. Human civilization began by putting purpose and intelligent purpose behind gods associated with the sun, the moon, the planets, the wind, the earth, the oceans. It's been, by one estimate, over 1,000 different gods throughout human history. Mars, god of war, Poseidon, Thor, all the rest. And the really important thing is that all of you, or almost all of you probably, are now atheists regarding those gods. Just the only difference is it's just one that we may disagree about. But 999, we all agree, have been thrown out. And the reason they've been thrown out is they've been buried by the rise of our physical understanding. Science works. And the fact that science works has buried the gods of the wind and the sun and the moon. Farmers now, as I was just saying, when it doesn't rain, they don't pray for rain anymore. They go see a meteorologist. And that's a good thing. In the process, the human condition has improved immensely, and it will continue to improve as science continues to bury the one remaining God. Now, this one God is supposedly left. We might ask a priori or in advance, how likely is in advance that all those other 999 gods were false, but this one's true? Well, you might argue, if you had a flat prior, that it's probably pretty small likelihood. But it doesn't really matter. The point is that our current understanding of nature has changed. We've learned things. It's changed and developed since the claims were made by Iron Age peasants who didn't even know the Earth orbited the sun. And therefore, it's natural that science is inconsistent with those claims based on ignorance. And we shouldn't revere those ancient claims as sacred. They're ignorant. There's still many open questions. I'll try my 10 seconds of humility. It'll be the only time tonight. There's a lot we don't know about the universe, a lot more we don't know than we do. That's the wonder of science. That's why I'm a scientist. But it is intellectually lazy to just stop asking questions and stop looking for physical explanations and just say God did it. That's lazy. And the other thing that's important in this extra God is there's nothing special about Jesus that's any different than the other gods, or any other fictional heroes for that matter. First of all, there's no empirical evidence that he was divine. None, not one iota. In that sense, he shares it with every other god that's ever been proposed. The myths associated with Jesus are associated with all the other myths, and the Bible. The flood myth, the Epic of Gilgamesh, which was written well before the Bible, exactly the same. The hero of the Bible was asked to create an ark and put all the species 2 by 2 on 7 levels. Same thing. Virgin birth, nothing special about Jesus. Well, look at all these. They're all supposed to have been born of virgins. The whole story, in fact, take Dionysus, the Greek god of wine, versus Jesus. It's exactly the same. They were both born from a virgin mother. They were fathered by the King of Heaven. They returned from the dead. They transformed water into wine. In fact, they, talked about eating and drinking the flesh and blood of the Creator. They were taken as a liberator of mankind. That story has been told over and over again, and this is just one of the most recent renderings. Nothing special. And the resurrection is nothing special. The myth of resurrection has been around since Osiris. Osiris was one of the major Egyptian gods, and it used to be just the kings in Egypt would be resurrected when Osiris was resurrected. But eventually, in the New Kingdom, anyone could be resurrected with Osiris. I was going to say with Jesus, but it doesn't matter. If they follow the correct religious rituals, the same nonsense. Now, the point is that the fact that these beliefs are in fact being destroyed is related to the fact that the belief depends upon not just time, not just history, and the fact is, frankly, that in the Western world at least, the number of people who have a religious affiliation is monotonically going down. But it depends on where you live. If you were born in the U.S., and you're religious, you believe in the Bible and Jesus. If you're born in India and you're religious, you might believe in Brahman and who's manifest through Gensha. If you're from the Islamic world, you think the Quran is the perfect word of God and Muhammad is the latest prophet. It's kind of interesting that your belief depends on where you're from. But what's great is we live in a world where information is becoming more freely available. And because of that global access to information, we are seeing religion go down. Because people are learning that the myths and lies that they've been taught, when they learn about the rest of the world, that other people believe other myths and lies that are inconsistent with their myths and lies. And that's why we're seeing religion dying more and more. And it's the center of the debate, and it's clear. The motion is science refutes God. And Michael and I have the distinct advantage here of arguing in favor of the motion because, in fact, we have evidence, reason, logic, rationality, and empirical methods on our side, whereas their opponents have vague hopes and fears. And they're arguing in favor of a motion that's hanging on for its existence by mere shreds of emotional and ideological spaghetti, much like this type provided by the flying spaghetti monster, one of the many equally irrational gods which science provides no support for. But I first want to begin by clarifying the nature of the motion, because the motion isn't science disproves God, it's science refutes God. And that's very important because you can't disprove a notion that's basically vague and unfalsifiable. There's no way to disprove the notion that God didn't create all of us 15 seconds ago with the memories of the amusing comments we heard before that. There's no way we can disprove that. Okay, and that's really important to recognize that those kind of unfalsifiable notions are unfalsifiable, as I say. But we can ask, is it rational to expect that that's likely? And tonight I want to emphasize that 500 years of science have demonstrated that God, that vague notion, is not likely. It's irrational to believe in God. Now, to refute God means refuting several claims. One, that are all based on faith, not evidence. One, that God is necessary. Two, that there is evidence for God. And three, that belief is rational. And the point is that the progress of science has shown over and over and over again that all the answers to all those three questions are no, 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 no. Now, my own scientific field is cosmology, and that's a study of the origin and evolution of the universe as a whole. And it's where science and religion sort of confront each other. And creation myths have abounded throughout human history, and science confronts those creation myths. But I want to point out that our opponents, I'm pretty sure, are going to argue first that one aspect of science that supports perhaps the belief in God is this notion that the universe is apparently fine-tuned for life. I hear that a lot. And because it was fine-tuned so life could exist, that is a remarkable and, in fact, cosmic misunderstanding. Because it's the same kind of misunderstanding that led people to believe in special creation for life on Earth before Darwin. It looked like everything was designed for the environment in which it lived. But what Darwin showed us was that a simple proposition, namely that there's genetic variation among a population combined with natural selection, meant that you didn't need supernatural shenanigans. That in fact, all the diversity of life on Earth could arise from a single life form by natural law. And he didn't know, what he showed was it was plausible based on the evidence. He didn't know about DNA, he didn't know about the details of genetic replication, but he showed it was plausible. And as I'll say, that's where we're at now as far as the understanding of the universe is concerned. Who determines what's moral? God. Oh, which God? Is it the Quran, the one who still says women are inferior and chattel and need to be veiled and put in bags? That God?
That remains.
That remains to be decided. The point is there is moral improvement, and the moral improvement is because rationality, based on empirical evidence, based on the clear empirical fact that women are not inferior and gays are not bad, that moral improvement has occurred because of an empirical evidence. And as I say, the reason morality was needed to be improved is because we were more ignorant. And science has made us less ignorant.
I mean, it seems to me we could have been having this conversation 500 years ago. And life was difficult 500 years ago. There was a lot of despair. There were crops failed and disease spread, and people suffered just instantaneous and catastrophic changes in their fortune. And it was well under, the cause of all of this actually was well understood 500 years ago. It was witchcraft. And happily, the church had produced some very energetic men who had the gumption to deal with this problem. And so every year, some hundreds and sometimes thousands of women were burned alive for casting spells on their neighbors. Now, imagine what it would be like to be among the 5 or the 10% of people at most who recognize that the very belief in magic, the very belief in witchcraft, the very belief in good witches or bad witches was a malignant fantasy. That the white witches who were helping people with medicinal herbs and practicing midwifery, they were on no firmer ground than the black witches who were casting the evil eye. The whole belief system was at fault. Imagine the kind of criticism you're going to get. No, your problem is just with kind of fundamentalist witchcraft. The reality is that witchcraft is far more nuanced than that, and there's no conflict between science and witchcraft. I mean, science deals with physical law and physical causality, but witchcraft deals with potent spells and the internal connections between things. This idea that somehow we shouldn't call into question these patently bad ideas for fear of offending people, for fear of glossing over their despair, for fear of not criticizing other problems in the world. I would never argue that religion is the only problem in the world or the only source of human conflict, but it is a source. And we are mightily attached to it, emotionally attached to it. And we are loath to criticize it even when it is declaring its ugliest intentions and its ugliest certainties. The problem with the Bible is however you pick and choose, whether you're a literalist or a selective literalist, the problem is there's just a mountain of divisive nonsense in there, and that's where people get ideas about homosexuality being an abomination, and why our country in the 21st century debates gay marriage as though it were the great moral issue of our time. This is coming from religion, and it seems to me that it's time we had an honest conversation about that.
I mean, it's not without its joys. I mean, there's some very good writing in there, and there's some rather terrifying barbarism in there that is advocated not as allegory, but as prescriptions for how to live. And I think that's undeniable. Many of these prescriptions have lost their shelf life. I mean, the Bible, on balance, tells us to keep slaves. It tells us how to keep slaves. Now, this is an embarrassment. I think a rather fatal embarrassment to anyone who would then say the Bible is the best book of moral wisdom humanity has ever had. It's not the best book because it gets the question of slavery wrong, and slavery is perhaps the easiest and one of the most consequential moral problems we've ever had to face as a civilization. But the basic point here is that, for me, that is so troubling, is that there is this claim being made by most religious people most of the time that one of their books is not an ordinary book. One of their books is a magic book. It seems to be believed that the contents of the Bible or the contents of the Quran are so impeccable, so prescient of our needs as a species that they could not possibly have been written by human beings. This is patently absurd when you read the books. I mean, just compare for a moment another human project. Isaac Newton went into isolation in the year 1665 to escape the plague. He spent 18 months working in his garret, and at the end of that time, he had invented calculus. He had invented the field of optics. He had discovered the universal law of gravitation and the laws of motion. And he came out and delivered this, and scientists in almost any field agree that this is probably the most startling use of human intelligence in the history of human intelligence, and yet no one for a moment is tempted to believe that God had to help him with this. This was not under the dictation of the Holy Spirit. In fact, we know that Newton was a thoroughly unpleasant, megalomaniacal, neurotic man, and we have superseded his insights to some significant degree, but it took 200 years of continuous ingenuity on the part of some of the smartest people who have ever lived to do this. I say this rather often. We could improve the Bible in 5 seconds, and that's problematic for the claim that it is the best book really on any subject. I have never for a moment believed, and I have never argued, that all bad things, all conflict, comes out of religion. I don't even know if most does. I think probably most wars have been fought for reasons other than religious ideology. But the larger issue is dogmatism. The larger issue is belief without sufficient evidence, belief that is intrinsically divisive because it is immune to criticism, it is immune to the normal tests of conversation, tests of reasonableness, and these beliefs that divide us into these separate moral communities where we have Christians against Muslims against Jews, or blacks against whites, or one nation against another nation based on nationalism. I think nationalism can be incredibly corrosive of everything we want to encourage in civilization. Dogmatism and ideology immune to criticism is a problem. The problem, however, is that only in religion do we put a veneer of sanctity over dogmatism and call it faith, and once called faith, it becomes a apparently necessary and redeeming and precious part of the human experience. I don't think it is, and I think we can have our ethics and have our spiritual experience, indeed even become mystics, without ever presupposing anything on insufficient evidence and without ever lying to ourselves and other human beings about what we know to be true.
One of my primary concerns, whenever I criticize Islam, one of the first things I say is that nobody is suffering under Islam more than Muslims. I mean, and certainly nobody's suffering more than Muslim women. And so to obfuscate, to call it racist, to criticize this faith, which has I mean, the record of religion in general in terms of the treatment of women is horrifying. I mean, the great geniuses of the Abrahamic tradition thought about the riddle of womanhood, and they gave us this cult of virginity, the forced marriages, bride burning, honor killing. I mean, it is the fact that somebody like Ayaan Hirsi Ali, a Somali woman who became a Dutch parliamentarian and now is arguably one of the most hunted people on this planet because of her criticism of Islam, the idea that she has to deal with a multiculturalist criticism of her insensitivity to Islam, and this is a woman who has been, circumcised is a euphemism for it, hunted, had her collaborator butchered in the street in Amsterdam, and now she is a recipient of the same kind of criticism. It is obscurantism.
Where do you think such longing arises?
Well, I think the longing for comfort is not hard to understand. Death is a terrible blow, and our species is unique in all the species on the planet in being able to imagine our deaths and knowing that we're going to die and not liking that idea. And I think we have two competing urges. This is not so much my theory as the theory of several other people that I discuss in my book. One of them is, and these are rooted actually in our biology. They're even rooted in our genes. And one of them is to get away from a corpse. It's dangerous. It's a source of disease. It is something to withdraw from. At the same time, this is a loved one, and that's something to approach. So we're tugged in two completely different directions, and you can't just leave the body of a loved one, you have to do something.
But this
And out of that grows the rituals, the burial rituals, and out of that grows the sense that that person is still there. After all, your head is still teeming with, well, I wonder if she'd like, and what would she think of, and can she see me now? All of these habits of mind that we have about anybody that's close to us, whether we love them or hate them, actually. Those habits don't just stop when a person dies. And so it's very natural to understand how those habits could be turned into a sort of hallucinatory presence.
What we might call Dostoevsky's mistake, and that is, if God is dead, everything is permitted. Now, that does not follow at all. That is a myth that has done a tremendous amount of damage in the world, and any atheists who think that an implication of their atheism is that there's no difference between right and wrong, that there's no room for morality, I think it has made a very serious mistake. It's a mistake which is very easily made because so many religious people insist on this principle as well. They seem to think that without God, there can't be any goodness, there can't be any morality. This is belied, I think, by everything we know. And notice, finally, that even if it were true that we needed God to tell us what's right and wrong, God doesn't tell us. Only God's self-appointed representatives on earth tell us. So in other words, we're going to have to tell each other anyway. Human beings can figure out what is reasonable, what is rational, and what is moral. Human society has evolved to the point where we can sit down and reason, and of our own free will arrive at the best principles to govern our lives by our own lights after open, free, reasonable discussion, fact-based discussion. That's the basis of morality. It's always been the basis of morality. If you look at the morality in the Old Testament, compare it to the morality today, you'll find that it has changed a great deal, and it has changed because people's ideas about what makes sense, what's right and wrong, have evolved. They've grown up. And it's not because God told them something different today than told them before. It's they just figured out that they could no longer tolerate the interpretations of what God was supposedly telling them morality was, that used to pass muster. So we're stuck telling each other as best we can how to live our lives and what makes sense morally. And if it helps you to adorn that process with an imagined deity that speaks to you, that's a psychological fact about you, but it plays no role in the discussion.
One that's been interesting me more recently is how a number of social institutions depend on the ignorance of those that they exploit. Whether it's a Ponzi scheme where the individual investors are sort of almost complicit in their ignorance of what's going on because it's not worth their while to be too inquisitive about what's going on until it's too late. And in particular, religions. I think that perhaps the single most important change in the world as far as religion is concerned is electronic communication. The internet and cell phones, transistor radios for that matter, going back a little bit. For thousands of years, religions thrived in an environment where information was hard to come by, and you could more or less assume that individual members of each group were not only ignorant of other religions, but even ignorant of a lot of their own religion's history and practices. And this easily maintained ignorance was, I think, sort of the lifeblood of religious solidarity. Our bodies are composed of maybe even 100 trillion cells, and they cooperate pretty well. The human ones are only about 10%. of those, and the rest are all visitors of one sort or another. And just take your human cells, the ones that have your genome. The body never has to worry about, your thumbs learning something and then rebelling and deciding to abandon ship. They are on their life mission has been determined in development from the moment that they were born became the daughter cell of some mother cell, and they don't have any wherewithal to learn about the outside world and wonder whether or not maybe life would be better if they were not quite so cooperative. And religions were like that. Religions could rely on, and notice when I say rely on, there's nobody doing this relying. This is the religion itself that is designed by natural selection in such a way as to presuppose the relative ignorance of the parts that make it up. You don't have to go to special lengths to shield the parts from information. Now that's all changed. It's changed hugely. And I think every religion in the world is on the cusp of either going extinct or transforming itself in ways that are really radical. There's no other option. They simply will not be able to continue with the information that is now readily available. They can do the sort of religious equivalent of Bashar al-Assad and enslave the people, imprison the people, kill the people. But if you're not prepared to put all the people basically in prison, they're going to get the information, and that's going to change everything. So my prescription for what we should be doing is very firmly but gently informing, letting people all over the world know about each other's religions and letting them mull those facts over. And if the leaders of those religions have to revise their practices to account for the fact that this is happening, they're going to transform religions in ways that are hard to imagine, but I think largely favorable.
The argument from design was once quite a powerful argument. It's the watchmaker's argument. Richard Dawkins has a book, The Blind Watchmaker, that says, well, if things happen by evolution, how could they all fit together so well? It seems like everything works well in the universe. There are signs of things having been designed. Certainly people of the past thought that animals were created for us to eat and for us to wear their skins, and they pointed to other things in nature like the fact that if water did not expand when it froze, then ponds would freeze solid and fish would die and so on. There are things that people regarded as being beautifully designed, including our own organs and the organs of animals, which seem to have certain functions and purposes. But of course, now that we understand the Darwinian theory of evolution, that argument has fallen into disrepute. We understand much better how it is that we have certain organs, how it is that beings exist, that they have evolved over barely imaginable periods of time. Only those that were indeed adapted to their environment and could survive and reproduce left descendants that are still with us. And I think the fossil record now shows that, and more recently our understanding of genetics shows our own biological relationship with very simple organisms, including bacteria with whom we share some genes, and then progressively we share more genes with beings more like us until we get up to the great apes, chimpanzees, with whom we share something like 98% of our genes. So I think evolution is one of the most firmly established scientific theories with a huge amount of evidence for it, and we don't therefore need the argument from design to explain how the universe comes to be like it is. So the arguments for the existence of God seem to me to be not strong. Now, interestingly, in the Protestant tradition, those arguments fell into disrepute quite a long time ago. And so Protestants began to disavow the arguments and say, what really matters is faith. But what is faith? Faith is really just believing in something for which you have neither rational arguments nor good evidence. I know that John is a mathematician by training, so I'm sure he's familiar with the 19th century mathematician and philosopher William Clifford, who wrote a very nice essay about faith, using as an analogy a ship owner who was about to send to sea a ship full of immigrants. We can imagine they were coming to Australia, if you like, since many immigrants did set sail from England in the 19th century for Australia. And as we know, of course, you only have to go down to the Great Ocean Road and you find many places where some of those ships foundered and sank with great loss of life, for example, around Lockard. But this ship owner that Clifford imagines is uncertain whether his ship is seaworthy enough to make the long voyage to bring the immigrants to the new land. But he thinks about it and he says, well, look, after all, there's a divine providence. And how could a divine providence allow these good people who are going to establish their futures, men, women, and children even, who are, at least the children, innocent of any sin, how could he allow them to drown on the way to the new world? So I will have faith in God, and I won't bother to inspect the ship to see whether it's seaworthy, because I have faith that it will reach Australia. Well, of course, as I say, we know that some ships did not, and we would fault this ship owner and say, you can't just have faith in that way. You need to check the evidence. You need to look at it. The ship owner's faith would have put lives at risk, and unfortunately, in the real world today, faith also puts lives at risk. In fact, the refusal of the Roman Catholic Church to tolerate the use of condoms, even in regions of sub-Saharan Africa where the risk of contracting HIV/AIDS is extremely high, has undoubtedly not merely put lives at risk, but cost perhaps millions of innocent human lives. We pay a high price for the religious faith of some religious leaders. I don't understand why it would be a simpler explanation to say that the world was created by a divine being who has existed forever than it would be to say that the universe has existed forever. It seems to me that to say the universe has existed forever is a simpler explanation. Now, your argument was that the universe actually hasn't existed forever, that science says there was a Big Bang, and this in some way supports the creationist account of the universe. All I'm saying is that science doesn't say that. Science only says the observable universe began 13-point-something billion years ago, and with a kind of a bang, and has been expanding since. That's all it says, and that's all it can say. So I'm simply saying there is no argument here to believe that your hypothesis, that it was created by a divine being, is in any better shape than the hypothesis that it has always existed. Yes, we are Darwinian primates. We are, that is, primates who have evolved from other primates. I think that's established scientifically. Dinesh doesn't deny it, as I understand his position. Do we have to believe that there is some transcendental spark that is contrary to the evolutionary account in order to explain why we have morality and why we behave as we do, and why occasionally heroic people jump in and save heavy, drowning strangers, although also very often they don't? I don't think we do need any such account. I think we can explain the existence of compassion, concern for others, in the way we have evolved as mammals, as beings who've had to take care of their own children, as beings who've lived in small communities where we're often related to other members of the community and want to save them and support them, and that helps the survival of our genes as well. And of course, as social beings who live in communities that reciprocate, as indeed our close primate relatives do as well. We're not unique in this. And form reciprocal bonds. And there's a lot of research that suggests that the best strategy in these conditions is, at least initially, to help strangers. And only if it turns out that they are not going to help you, do you then cease to help them or even pay them back for the bad deeds they do you. The simple ethic known as tit for tat works quite well in game theory that models evolution. So it's possible to explain why we do some of the rescues we do in those ways. Some people perhaps have this to a stronger degree than others and therefore are more likely to do the rescues. I do think that the evidence, if you're relying on historical evidence, the evidence is extremely thin. We know that there are many cases where people claim to have seen all sorts of things, claim that they've had all kinds of visions, that people have appeared to them, that they've been cured, and generally we are skeptical about such claims.
And rightly so.
Right, okay, so given, you said there are documents from the 1st century, okay, but the 1st century is compatible with, if we assume that the tradition is that Jesus was crucified in around 30, then we're talking about people who were writing, who were perhaps the grandchildren or the great-grandchildren of those who were supposed to witness it. Now we know that stories get twisted and new stories get invented. You only have to play Chinese whispers with 50 people and, see what comes out at the end after you whisper something in at the beginning.
But that isn't true, Peter, really, because the Apostle Paul was writing in the early 50s. It's much nearer to the time than that. Now, I'm a little bit older than you. I can remember things very clearly 20, 30 years back and so on. So I think the gap is
but Paul was not an eyewitness, right? Paul was reporting what other people said.
Yeah, but he was an eyewitness of something. You were saying that a lot of people, many people have to be a believer in the resurrection before they do anything else. Paul wasn't. He was absolutely against Jesus, and it was an appearance of the risen Christ that was the foundation of his conversion. So he was not a believer when he met Jesus.
Right, so it was one of these kinds of visions that I was talking about that he had, or apparition or something like that, and that's what I'm saying. We know many people have these, sometimes about their religious beliefs, sometimes about aliens coming from Mars or somewhere and kidnapping them. And we're normally very skeptical about this. And we understand that in Paul's day, people maybe were not quite so skeptical, but we would think that they should have been.
Religion does not enhance your moral judgment. Religion compromises your moral judgment. Religion gets in the way. Religion is an added layer. It's an obstruction. Suppose I were to break into somebody's home, this loving Christian family, mother, father, and children and pets. They go to church, they pray, they contribute to charity. They're really, really great people. And I tied them up, and I tortured them, and I drowned the cat in the bathtub, and I shoot the dog, and then I set the house on fire and kill all those people. And then the police asked me, Dan, why did you do that? And I would say, no reason, the devil made me do it. Raise your hands if you think I'm a moral monster. Virtually every hand went up, right? Yeah, horrible, moral monster. How would he do? No reason. The devil made me do it. The second story was this. I got out my Bible and I opened the Bible to the book of Job. Remember how God tortured Job? He caused a wind to blow the building over. The wall crashed against those children and killed his children, killed his livestock and his animals. And then God tortured Job with boils and horrible things that happened. If you want a magic bullet, by the way, that totally destroys Christianity in the Bible, you will find it in one Bible verse. It's the book of Job 2:3, the second chapter, verse 3. Let me read this to you. The Lord said unto Satan, have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him in the earth, a blameless and an upright man, that fears God. He turns away from evil, and still he holds fast his perfection. He holds fast his integrity. God said this to Satan, and then he said, although you moved me against him to destroy him without cause. So God, why did you do this to Job? No reason. The devil made me do it. So then I asked that audience, okay, raise your hands if you think the God of the Bible is a moral monster. Can you guess what happened? Less than half of the hands went up in that audience. Isn't that proof that religion compromises our moral judgment? We are loyal to the slave master. We are loyal to the Lord. We don't want to threaten. We don't want to say anything bad about the Father. We submit. We become these humble servants of the Lord, and we'll let Him figure all these things out.
How much respect would you have for a doctor who runs around cutting people with a knife in order to sell them a Band-Aid? Well, that's what Christianity is. Christianity's got it all wrong. It's telling you that you're bad. You're horrible. You're just not a good person. Of course, there is a violent tendency within our species, but there's also a naturally evolved, instinctive, altruistic tendency. We are naturally good people. When someone commits a horrible deed, what do you say? That was an inhuman thing to do. We assume that the basic human thing to do is good. We who are outside the Christian system, we don't assume the worst about human nature. In fact, assuming the worst can be a self-fulfilling prophecy. You can think, oh, I'm a horrible sinner, I need to confess to Jesus. But we think that since salvation is a phony solution to a phony problem, we think that if salvation is the cure, then atheism is the prevention. Just don't buy into the sickness. Don't view yourself as sick and needing a savior. I did a debate in Queens, New York with a Muslim opponent, and afterwards I told Ali, I told him, you Muslims, you're so kind and good, and they gave me gifts and they fed me food, and it was just a wonderful experience to meet this Muslim community. And I said, Ali, you people are so nice. And he said, well, Don, Allah commands me to be nice to you. And I'm thinking, oh, I didn't say this, but I'm thinking, oh, you mean you're restraining yourself? You really don't want to be nice to me because God's telling you to? You're being nice to me? The Abrahamic religion system is totally upside down about human nature. We, atheists and agnostics, don't view anything wrong with us. Of course, our understanding is limited, and that's what drives science. But we think that if you're motivated to be a good person because of the promise of heaven, that shows how little you think of other people, really. Or if you're motivated to be a good person because of the threat of hell, that shows how little you think of yourself. We humanists think that human beings should be good for goodness' sake.
Then there's the inconvenient fact that our religions allow for and support some of the most barbaric practices we have ever perpetrated on one another, and have therefore the creator of the universe has failed to answer the easiest moral questions, in this case slavery. I mean, slavery, Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, was right to say that slavery is supported in the Bible. There's no question it is. There's no honest reading of the Bible that can say this is the most articulate condemnation of slavery ever written. It would take a paragraph to perfectly express what is wrong with slavery, and it's not in the Bible. God clearly expects us to keep slaves. So that, to my mind, should just end the argument about whether we get should be getting our morality out of religion. Even fundamentalists have to edit the books. I mean, you come to the golden rule and you say, well, this is truly wise. That's why I'm reading the Bible. But then you come to something in Deuteronomy, like if a woman's not a virgin on her wedding night, she must be stoned to death on her father's doorstep. Every fundamentalist Christian and Orthodox Jew, and there are probably a few exceptions, but basically every sane one has figured out some way to ignore that. So what does that mean? That proves that the guarantor of the wisdom found in Scripture is not in Scripture. I mean, it's in us. It's in a larger conversation about what it constitutes to live a good life. We have a human conversation which has evolved over thousands of years of recorded history, and we can either locate ourselves in the 21st century, availing ourselves of all of the tools that we've acquired, all of the brilliant insights, some of which come from our religious traditions. But I think the golden rule is almost as good as we have as a moral algorithm. It's not original to Jesus, but it's perhaps it's best expressed in the Bible. It captures our intuitions of what it is to be ethical in so many respects. And so we can. The one thing to point out is that how is it that we find wisdom in Scripture? We find it based on our own ethical intuitions. I mean, you go to the Bible, you read in Deuteronomy, it says, if your bride is not a virgin on your wedding night, you should stone her to death on her father's doorstep. You recognize, oh, that's at best, at the very least, impractical, probably wrong, doesn't feel good. So you flip the page and then you find something like the Beatitudes, and that strikes you as, this is the wisdom of Christianity, say. That is something, you are the guarantor of the morality you are finding in Scripture.
Do you not find that naturalism is a sort of a bent, an angle that you're coming at, and that you allow nothing in that realm, but that you're so shut off from the beginning, nothing could ever meets the evidence?
There would be no problem for me to be persuaded out of naturalism. It's a matter of what is the model that best fits the data. Again, it is not an assumption. Some people try to sometimes say that science or naturalists start from an assumption of naturalism, so they just simply won't consider alternatives. I'm very happy to consider alternatives. I think that there were some phenomena in the world which really looked exactly like some religious tradition was saying should happen and was miraculous, was seemingly violating the laws of physics. What would scientists do in that situation? They would not say, we're not allowed to think about this because we agreed yesterday at faculty tea that the world was a natural world. I think they would try to come up with the best explanation. If the best explanation is not naturalism, then I would buy that. I will say that naturalism seems to me to be a priori simpler than theism, because naturalism has the natural world, theism has the natural world and something else that I think is ill-defined. But I didn't actually use that. I think in a proper quantitative Bayesian probability analysis, my prior for naturalism is higher than my prior for theism, but overwhelming evidence will always take care of that. I just don't think it's there. If theism were really true, there's no reason for God to be hard to find. He should be perfectly obvious, whereas in naturalism, you might expect people believe in God, but the evidence to be thin on the ground. Under theism, you'd expect that religious beliefs should be universal. There's no reason for God to give special messages to this or that primitive tribe thousands of years ago. Why not give it to anyone? Whereas under naturalism, you'd expect different religious beliefs inconsistent with each other to grow up under different local conditions. Under theism, you'd expect religious doctrines to last a long time in a stable way. Under naturalism, you'd expect them to adapt to social conditions. Under theism, you'd expect the moral teachings of religion to be transcendent, progressive, sexism is wrong, slavery is wrong. Under naturalism, you'd expect that they reflect, once again, local mores, sometimes good rules, sometimes not so good. You'd expect the sacred texts under theism to give us interesting information, tell us about the germ theory of disease, tell us to wash our hands before we have dinner. Under naturalism, you'd expect that sacred text to be a mishmash, some really good parts, some poetic parts, and some boring parts and mythological parts. Under theism, you'd expect biological forms to be designed. Under naturalism, they would derive from the twists and turns of evolutionary history. Under theism, minds should be independent of bodies. Under naturalism, your personality should change if you're injured, tired, or you haven't had your cup of coffee yet. Under theism, you'd expect that maybe you can explain the problem of evil. God wants us to have free will, but there shouldn't be random suffering in the universe. Life should be essentially just. And at the end of the day, in theism, you basically expect the universe to be perfect. Under naturalism, it should be kind of a mess. This is very strong empirical evidence.
It is absolutely true that science in the Western world owes its existence to the church. Historically. Big deal. It's a historical fact that, first of all, the church was the only seat of power and money, and therefore education, from medieval times, even before medieval times onward. So it was if you wanted to study science, you had to go to a university which had to be supported by the church because it was the only seat of power and money. So the fact that there's this early connection between the origins of science and religion is historical. Interesting,
but doesn't say anything about science. Moreover, the wonderful thing about children is they grow up. So the church is the mother of science. But the great thing about children is they grow up, and the even better thing for some children is they leave home. Parents here who are in that situation parents here who aren't in that situation will bemoan the fact that some children don't leave home. But science originated in the only form of education there was, but it grew up. And then the questions that science asked progressed. The set questions that religion asked didn't progress. Because the difference between science and religion is that we don't assume the answers before we ask the questions. We let nature tell us the answers. Science doesn't make universal claims. Science constantly changes, which is the great thing about science. As I often say as a theoretical physicist, that the two best states to be in are wrong and confused, because those mean there's something to learn. So science, by definition, evolves and changes in the face of evidence. The fact is that science is done by scientists, and scientists are human. But the scientific enterprise progresses because it does not rely on human intuition, human desire, human weakness. It relies on what works, and what works survives, and what doesn't work goes out like yesterday's newspaper. It's just the way that's what's so wonderful about it. The reason we train students in science and force them to do these incredibly boring problems that turn most people off science is to try and build up some intuition so that later on your intuition may be reliable. So that's the first thing. But the most important part of science is that we also don't trust scientific intuition. Absolutely, we try and develop scientific intuition, which often means overcoming normal intuition, because our myopic view of reality is usually wrong. But we distrust it, and that's the real key. We distrust it because we say, okay, prove it. In fact, prove it wrong. And prove it, and as Feynman said, scientists not only try and prove themselves right when they have a good idea based on intuition, the good scientists try and prove themselves wrong. And that's the hardest part of science.
Notice that Andy has not offered us any evidence for his God tonight, for his hypothesis. All he is arguing for is our ignorance of the answer to certain scientific questions. That's not arguing for a God, that's arguing for ignorance. And then, oh, here's a gap, let's plug it with something. And maybe the God of the Bible kind of fits that, maybe. That's not an argument for a God. That's not evidence at all. There is evidence that we have some unanswered questions. We all admit that. I agree, there is plenty of evidence that there are some questions in science we don't have a clue about. Every scientist will tell you that. Well, that's what drives science. That's what makes science exciting.
Science is a process. We all can do it or not do it. I refuse to accept a dichotomy between scientists. All of us do science from the time we're children. That's how we learn. Kids put their hands in flames and discover it's hot. That's what makes us grow up and learn how to deal with the world. And one of the things I fight the most is the notion that somehow science should be the domain of scientists. The scientific process should be applied broadly to our public policy and the way we live, because it's useful and it works and it enhances our lives. But it's not the domain of a small group of people with hoods.
So unlike God, who is an artist and can't be predicted, nature is not an artist. Nature plays by the rules. Nature makes predictions. Nature provides explanations. Thank you.
Just like science and politics are intertwined, so is religion and politics. So to answer where is religion heading is to answer where is the world heading. I don't see a future where religion can be separated from culture, science, politics, power plays, everything. If I wanted to believe something, it would be that religion is heading towards where it gives less and less room for fundamentalist violence, oppression. I think that if we were to look at history and draw out the line, we would see that religion has moved in that direction, and hopefully it will continue to do so. But again, everything else will determine that also.
After a climatic crisis, it's very easy to imagine now something like a titanic volcanic explosion in Indonesia that blotted out the sun, that altered the whole climate against us. It's thought that the species went down to about 5,000. In fact, in other words, before they decided to make the migration north, find somewhere cooler, abandon the savannah for which our bodies are designed. We were 5,000 casualties short of going the way that 98.9% of every species ever found to be present on this earth has already gone into extinction. I'll say it again. Effectively 99% of every species ever on earth has already become extinct. And nearly us. Some design, some father, some caring God, some designing supervisor. There is no recourse to a dictatorial authority in this. It's very lucky that we're here. The randomness in that case worked in our favor. Francis Collins, the Christian genome scientist, thinks we've been here maybe 100,000 years. Richard Dawkins thinks maybe 250,000. I'll take 100,000 years. For 98,000 of those years, if you're a Christian, you have to believe heaven watched with folded arms. Most people died of climatic crises in Africa, or just watched their children die as soon as they were born, or saw them perhaps struggle for a few years. Life expectancy maybe 25. People dying of their teeth, of revolting deficiency diseases, misery, struggle, famine, turf wars over women, turf wars over territory, terror at any supernatural seeming event, an earthquake, a comet, everything a nightmare, a mystery, no germ theory of disease, fear, trembling. For 98,000 years, heaven watches that, not caring, and then says, 2,000 years ago, it's time to intervene. Why don't we give God a son and murder him cruelly in an illiterate part of the Middle East? That ought to solve it. That's what you have to believe to be a Christian. Well, I invite you to believe it. But I can't envy you. The sheer strenuousness, the unbelievable contempt for evidence, the fantastic indifference to everything that humanity has actually succeeded in finding out about itself and its cosmos and its species, that you need to keep this little cult alive.
This is a map of world religion as it's distributed across the globe, and you can see that this is it's partitioned at the boundaries of nations. Now, I think my colleague and friend Richard Dawkins was the first to point this out. At least I'm sure I got this from him. That this is not the way truth spreads itself over the globe. I mean, this should look suspicious. I mean, religion is not in the truth business if this is how it's partitioned.
The agnostic philosopher Paul Draper has pointed out recently that if theism were true, we would expect God to act in the world in ways that science must take into account. An all-powerful being who seeks a loving relationship with humanity would probably act, in one way or another, directly or indirectly, as a causal agent in the history of the universe. And consequently, scientific accounts of that history would have to take his actions into account. If theism were true, then, it would be extremely surprising that science can ignore God and still explain so much. And yet it does. So, the success of naturalistic science, I think, favors atheism over theism.
In any argument, any debate, the burden of proof rests on the shoulders of the person who makes the claim, not on the shoulders of the person who doubts or who is skeptical of the claim. If I were to say, Jerry, I have invented a perpetual motion machine. I really have. It works, it's great. And Jerry were to say, I'm skeptical. Prove it to me. Can I just fold my arms and say, no, prove that I haven't. Is that the way to do a debate? Jerry and I both agree that there's a natural world, but he's making an additional claim above and beyond what we both agree with. He has the burden of proof. If I were to say leprechauns exist, and most of you would doubt it. I'm sure you doubt that leprechauns exist, but there's evidence for leprechauns. There really is. Have you ever eaten a box of Lucky Charms? There's evidence. I mean, people can draw them and describe them. But those of us who doubt leprechauns, are we responsible for disproving the existence of leprechauns? Can't we, as skeptics, simply say, I'm not going to believe that until you make your case? Atheists don't claim that God has been disproved, although you can disprove God in some ways. Basically, atheists claim that God has been unproved. Atheism is not a belief. Atheism is not a claim. Atheism is not a moral philosophy. Atheism is not some system. Atheism is simply the absence of theism. Okay, a primal cause is just a word. It's a philosophical word. In fact, it kind of begs the question because it assumes when you use that word primal that there was a first. So if you're asking that question, you're asking a loaded question. You're almost asking a theological question or a metaphysical question. Well, the questions scientists do ask is, was our current Big Bang of the current observable universe, was that caused or not? Was there something preceding that? Many or most cosmologists today are putting forth the hypothesis of the multiverse. Not that the multiverse caused, but that the multiverse allows for the numbers to be large enough for the likelihood of life-friendly universes to be high enough to allow observers like us to be there. So let's ask it this way. Jerry has a hypothesis over here. Scientists have a hypothesis over here, the multiverse, let's say, or there's other hypotheses, string theory or whatever, and they are not proved yet. Neither is Jerry's hypothesis proved. These hypotheses naturally emerge from the mathematics of chaotic inflation. They can be modeled mathematically. They don't break the laws of nature. They can be coherently defined in some way. Their properties can be defined. Jerry's hypothesis cannot be modeled mathematically. It cannot be coherently defined. It doesn't follow any laws of nature. It is not even on the table as a natural hypothesis. It doesn't even have a coherent definition to it. Let me just ask you, if you have both of those hypotheses on the table, which one do you think is going to be the more likely one to be the answer in the future? A naturalistic one that you can understand, that you can define, that's coherent, that can be modeled mathematically, or one that has none of that? So you're asking us to jump out of science is what you're asking us to do. The multiverse might not be true, but right now you have to agree that most cosmologists are putting that forth as a viable scientific hypothesis, which can be testable and falsifiable, while yours cannot.